Each year, declassified documents from the former Soviet Union reveal the staggering scale of Cold War experimentation that took place in some of the most isolated and inhospitable regions on Earth. With over 240 secret installations scattered across the Arctic Circle alone, many of which remain sealed and guarded to this very day. The Soviet biological weapons program, known as Biopreparat, employed more than 60,000 scientists and technicians at its peak, with an estimated annual budget exceeding 7 billion rubles, all dedicated to creating organisms that could survive nuclear winter and devastate enemy populations long after conventional warfare had rendered the planet uninhabitable. During the final years of the Cold War between 1985 and 1987, when Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost policies were just beginning to crack open the Iron Curtain of secrecy, one particular installation on the remote archipelago of Novaya Zemlya was conducting experiments so dangerous that even the Soviet military command considered them reckless, pushing the boundaries of what biological science could achieve and creating something that would fundamentally challenge humanity's ability to contain its own creations. For precisely 72 hours in late January of 1987, Installation Vostok 7 initiated a complete quarantine protocol that locked down its entire facility, sealing 14 scientists and military personnel inside subterranean levels, buried beneath 200 meters of permafrost and reinforced concrete, a protocol that, according to every standard procedure, should have automatically terminated after 3 days, but somehow never did. But what exactly was the biological agent that Soviet scientists designated as Object 47? And why does Installation Vostok 7 remain an actively monitored exclusion zone more than 3 decades later, with automated defense systems still running on backup generators that were never designed to function for more than 72 hours? The Novaya Zemlya archipelago stretches across roughly 90,000 square kilometers of desolate Arctic wasteland, positioned between the Barents Sea and the Kara Sea at coordinates that place it well within the Arctic Circle, where winter temperatures routinely plummet to minus 40 degrees Celsius, and the sun disappears completely for months at a time during the polar night. This frozen expanse of rock and ice served as the Soviet Union's primary nuclear testing ground throughout the Cold War, witnessing 224 nuclear detonations between 1955 and 1990, including the infamous Tsar Bomba in 1961, the largest thermonuclear device ever detonated in human history, which released energy equivalent to 50 megatons of TNT and created a mushroom cloud that rose 64 kilometers into the stratosphere. The combination of extreme isolation, naturally occurring permafrost that could preserve biological materials indefinitely, and existing military infrastructure designed to withstand nuclear blasts, made Novaya Zemlya the perfect location for experiments that Soviet command wanted, kept far from prying eyes, whether those eyes belonged to American satellites or to the Soviet citizenry itself. It is perhaps unsurprising, then, that when Biopreparat needed a facility for its most ambitious and dangerous project, a location where catastrophic containment failure would threaten the smallest possible population, they chose the southern island of Novaya Zemlya, carving Installation Vostok 7 deep into the frozen granite bedrock where permafrost and reinforced concrete could create what scientists believed would be an impenetrable biological vault. The concept of organisms that could survive and even thrive in extreme cold, while simultaneously possessing the ability to devastate human populations, was not born in Soviet laboratories, but rather had roots stretching back to observations made by Russian explorers and indigenous Nenets people who had inhabited the Arctic regions for thousands of years. Ancient Nenets folklore spoke of what they called chorne plesin, or black mold, a substance that would occasionally emerge from thawing permafrost during brief summer periods, spreading across the tundra with unnatural speed and leaving behind the desiccated corpses of reindeer and Arctic foxes that appeared to have been consumed from the inside out. Russian Orthodox monks stationed at remote Arctic monasteries during the 16th and 17th centuries documented similar phenomena in their chronicles, describing outbreaks of mysterious illnesses that would strike suddenly during spring thaws affecting both wildlife and human settlements, with symptoms that included rapid tissue necrosis, respiratory failure, and in the final stages, a peculiar crystalline growth that would emerge from the victim's skin resembling frost patterns on winter windows. Soviet scientists reviewing these historical accounts in the early 1970s recognized patterns that suggested not mere superstition, but rather documented encounters with extremophile organisms, microorganisms that had evolved over millennia to survive frozen in permafrost for centuries before reactivating when conditions became favorable. And this recognition sparked the question that would ultimately lead to the creation of Object 47, specifically whether such organisms could be isolated, enhanced, and weaponized to create a biological agent that would remain dormant during nuclear winter, only to activate and spread once temperatures rose again. Military records declassified in the late 1990s revealed that Installation Vostok 7 was not the first Soviet facility to experiment with cold-resistant biological agents, but rather represented the culmination of 2 decades of increasingly aggressive research that had already produced several near-catastrophic incidents at other Arctic installations. In 1971, a research station designated Installation Polyus 3, located approximately 400 kilometers west of Vostok 7, reported a complete loss of communication that lasted for 11 days, after which a recovery team discovered the entire facility abandoned with signs of a hasty evacuation, including meals left half-eaten on tables and equipment still running, though no bodies were ever recovered, and the official explanation cited structural failure due to permafrost instability, despite the facility having been designed specifically to withstand such conditions. Similar encounters were reported by military personnel stationed at the Novaya Zemlya nuclear testing range throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, with at least 7 separate incidents documented in classified files, where cleanup crews working in areas of previous nuclear detonations reported equipment malfunctions, unusual organic growths appearing on protective gear. And in 3 cases, the sudden deaths of technicians whose autopsies revealed tissue damage inconsistent with any known pathogen, their internal organs showing signs of crystalline structures that appeared to have grown from within the cellular matrix itself. These incidents established a pattern that biopreparate scientists found both alarming and promising, suggesting that the extreme radiation and cold of Novaya Zemlya had created environmental conditions where naturally occurring extremophile organisms were undergoing accelerated evolution, adapting to survive in conditions that would sterilize conventional biological agents. And it was this observation that led Dr. Yevgeny Volkov, head of Biopreparate's Arctic Research Division, to propose the establishment of Installation Vostok 7 with the specific mandate to isolate, study, and enhance these organisms into a weapon that could survive the apocalypse itself. January 23, 1987, 14:30 hours, Installation Vostok 7's primary biological containment laboratory designated Level 4 deep, located 187 meters beneath the frozen surface of Novaya Zemlya, where Colonel Dr. Viktor Mikhailovich Sokolov, a 43-year-old microbiologist with 18 years of service in biopreparate and a reputation for methodical precision that had earned him the nickname Chasovshik, or the Watchmaker, among his colleagues, was overseeing what should have been a routine viability test of Object 47's latest iteration, the 17th generation of the organism that had been cultivated over the previous 11 months. Sokolov stood in the observation gallery alongside Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Kaverin, a young but exceptionally competent biosafety officer, and Dr. Irina Lebedeva, the installation's lead geneticist whose work on extremophile adaptation had been personally commended by the director of Biopreparate himself, while below them in the sealed containment chamber, 3 technicians in full hazmat suits were preparing to expose a controlled sample of Object 47 to simulated nuclear winter conditions, followed by rapid temperature increase to positive 15 degrees Celsius. The laboratory hummed with the constant background noise of air filtration systems cycling sterile atmosphere through 14 separate purification stages, fluorescent lights casting everything in the harsh bluish-white glow that made the stainless steel surfaces gleam like ice, while outside the reinforced concrete walls, Arctic wind screamed across the tundra at minus 42 degrees, a sound that penetrated even this deep underground as a distant hollow moaning that never quite ceased. Senior technician Pavel Usenko, a stocky man from Kiev with 12 years of experience handling biological agents, and known affectionately as Medved, or the Bear, for his physical strength and unshakable calm under pressure, manipulation, while his two assistants, technicians Grigory Nestorov and Anya Mikhailova, monitored environmental controls and documented every stage of the procedure with precision that bordered on obsessive, because everyone in Installation Vostok 7 understood that Object 47 represented the pinnacle of Soviet biological weapons research, and even the smallest deviation from protocol could have consequences that extended far beyond this frozen installation. The first manifestation that something had gone catastrophically wrong came not as a dramatic failure, but as something so subtle that it took Sokolov nearly 15 seconds to recognize it as anomalous, specifically when he noticed that the temperature readout for containment chamber Alpha had increased by exactly 0.3 degrees Celsius, despite no change having been initiated in the climate control sequence. And when he mentioned this discrepancy to Lieutenant Kaverin, the biosafety officer's face went pale as he checked and rechecked the environmental systems, finally stating in a voice that tried and failed to remain steady that the temperature increase was not being generated by their equipment, but rather appeared to be originating from within the sample container itself. Within 90 seconds of that initial observation, multiple monitoring stations throughout Level 4 Deep began confirming what everyone present desperately wanted to dismiss as instrument malfunction, specifically that Object 47 was exhibiting metabolic activity at a rate approximately 700% higher than any previous generation had demonstrated, and more disturbingly, this activity was accelerating exponentially rather than stabilizing, as theoretical models had predicted it would. Dr. Lebedeva's hands trembled as she reviewed the data streaming across her monitor screens, her voice taking on a sharp edge of panic as she reported that the organism appeared to be consuming the nutrient medium in the sample container at an impossible rate, while simultaneously generating heat as a metabolic byproduct, heat that was now registering at 12 degrees Celsius above ambient temperature and rising with each passing second, creating a localized thermal bloom that should have been biologically impossible for an organism that had been specifically engineered to thrive in sub-zero conditions. Inside the containment chamber, Technician Yusenko's voice crackled over the intercom with professional calm that didn't quite mask his growing concern, stating that he could actually see movement within the supposedly sealed sample container, describing what appeared to be a dark substance spreading across the interior surface of the reinforced glass in patterns that reminded him of frost crystals forming on winter windows. Except these patterns were growing outward from the center, at visible speed, branching and subdividing with geometric precision that suggested not random growth but rather something disturbingly close to purposeful expansion. The smell hit the observation gallery approximately 2 minutes into the cascade failure, despite the fact that the containment chamber was supposedly sealed with triple redundant HEPA filtration, a smell that Lieutenant Kaverin would later describe in his initial incident report as resembling ozone mixed with decaying organic matter and something else, something sharp and chemical that burned the inside of the nose and made the eyes water involuntarily, while Dr. Sokolov noticed with creeping horror that the metallic surfaces inside the containment chamber were developing a thin sheen of moisture, despite the air being maintained at precisely 18% humidity. Condensation that shouldn't exist and that was spreading across every surface like the laboratory itself was beginning to sweat. Electronic equipment throughout Level 4 Deep began experiencing cascading failures that the installation's technical staff would later be unable to explain, with digital clocks displaying impossible times, radiation monitoring badges worn by the containment chamber technicians suddenly registering exposure levels that jumped from normal background to alarming spikes, and back again within seconds. And most disturbingly, the facility's communications array began picking up interference that sounded disturbingly like human voices speaking in reversed audio, though analysis would later prove these sounds were generated by electromagnetic disturbances rather than actual speech, a distinction that provided little comfort to those who heard them. Technician Mikhailova, the youngest member of the containment team at just 26 years old, was the first to verbalize what everyone was thinking, her voice tight with barely controlled fear as she stated over the intercom that they needed to initiate emergency sterilization protocols immediately because Object 47 was not behaving according to any parameters that had been established during the previous 16 generations of development. And Dr. Sokolov found himself agreeing with her assessment, even as he recognized that initiating sterilization would mean destroying 11 months of research and likely ending his career. But careers meant nothing if they couldn't maintain containment of an organism that was demonstrating capabilities that exceeded every theoretical projection by orders of magnitude. The decision to initiate sterilization came approximately 4 minutes and 30 seconds after the initial temperature anomaly was detected, but those 4.5 minutes proved to be 4.5 minutes too long, because as Dr. Sokolov's hand moved toward the emergency sterilization override switch, a switch that would flood the containment chamber with a combination of formaldehyde vapor and ultraviolet radiation, intense enough to break down organic molecules at the molecular level. Technician Yusenko's calm voice suddenly transformed into a scream of pure animal terror that cut through the intercom with such intensity that it caused feedback whine in the observation gallery speakers. Through the triple-layered observation window, those in the gallery watched with mounting horror as Yusenko staggered backward from the sample container, his gloved hands clawing at his hazmat suit's faceplate, while dark tendrils of something that looked like black smoke but moved with predatory intelligence began spreading across the containment chamber's interior surfaces, flowing upward against gravity in defiance of physics, reaching toward the technicians with what could only be described as hunger. Technician Nestorov, demonstrating the kind of selfless courage that military commendations are written about, grabbed Yusenko and attempted to drag him toward the emergency decontamination airlock, but the older man's struggles became increasingly violent and uncoordinated, his screams degrading into wet, gurgling sounds that suggested something was happening to his respiratory system, despite the hazmat suit's independent air supply supposedly protecting him from any external contamination. Dr. Lebedeva began shouting for someone to activate the emergency medical team, while simultaneously demanding to know how Object 47 could possibly have breached the sample container's containment, because the theoretical scenarios they had wargamed had always assumed hours of warning before any potential escape, not this impossibly rapid cascade that had gone from minor temperature anomaly to full containment breach in less than 5 minutes. What happened next would be captured on the facility's security cameras in footage so disturbing that it would remain classified at the highest levels of Soviet and later Russian Federation security protocols, specifically the moment when technician Yusenko's struggles suddenly ceased and he went completely rigid, standing perfectly still in the center of the containment chamber, while the black substance that had been spreading across the surfaces began flowing across the floor toward him, like oil spreading across water, except this substance moved with purpose and direction, rather than following gravity or surface tension. Lieutenant Kavrin initiated the emergency sterilization sequence without waiting for Sokolov's authorization, his hand slamming down on the override switch with enough force to crack the plastic cover, and for approximately 3 seconds it appeared that the sterilization protocol might actually work. As formaldehyde vapor began flooding the chamber and ultraviolet lights blazed to life with intensity that forced everyone in the observation gallery to shield their eyes. But then the lights exploded in sequence, showering the containment chamber with sparks and broken glass, while the formaldehyde vapor seemed to be absorbed by the spreading darkness rather than sterilizing it. When visibility finally returned to the containment chamber, after the vapor cleared approximately 90 seconds after sterilization had been initiated, the scene that greeted those in the observation gallery would haunt their nightmares for whatever remained of their lives, specifically the sight of technician Pavel Yusenko, still standing in the center of the chamber, but no longer moving, no longer breathing, his hazmat suit torn open from the inside as if something had burst outward from his chest cavity, and most horrifying of all, the exposed flesh visible through the tears in the suit had transformed into something that resembled crystalline structures more than human tissue. Intricate geometric patterns of what looked like black ice spreading across his skin in fractals that caught the emergency lighting and reflected it in ways that should have been impossible for organic matter. The other two technicians, Nestorov and Mikhailova, had managed to reach the emergency airlock and were pounding on the sealed door while screaming to be let out, their voices raw with terror as the black substance continued spreading across every surface of the containment chamber, and Dr. Sokolov found himself faced with a decision that no amount of training or experience had prepared him for, specifically whether to open the airlock and potentially allow whatever had killed Yusenko to spread beyond the containment chamber, or to leave two young technicians sealed inside with an organism that had demonstrated capabilities far beyond anything Soviet science had predicted, an organism that was now spreading across the floor toward them with visible intent, while Yusenko's crystallized corpse stood in silent testimony to what awaited anyone touched by Object 47's latest and most terrifying evolution. Colonel Dr. Sokolov made the decision that would define the remaining 71 hours and 43 minutes of Installation Vostok 7's operational existence, specifically ordering Lieutenant Kavrin to maintain the containment chamber's lockdown while simultaneously initiating Protocol Zaslan, the facility's most extreme emergency response procedure that had been designed for exactly this type of catastrophic biological breach, but had never been tested under actual crisis conditions. The protocol required immediate isolation of Level 4 deep from all other sections of the installation, activation of secondary and tertiary containment barriers, and most critically, establishment of communication with Moscow Command to request authorization for what Soviet biological warfare doctrine euphemistically termed terminal sterilization, which in practical terms meant flooding the entire level with incendiary agents and raising the temperature to over 1,000 degrees Celsius for a minimum of 6 hours. Kavrin's hands shook as he entered the authorization codes into the command console, his voice cracking as he attempted to establish satellite uplink with the Biopreparat Command Center in Moscow. But what should have been a straightforward communication protocol instead produced only static, mixed with that same disturbing audio interference they had heard earlier. Sounds that, when played back and analyzed, would reveal patterns suggesting human speech played in reverse at varying speeds, though no linguistic analysis would ever successfully decode what was being said. Dr. Lebedeva had moved to a secondary workstation where she was frantically reviewing telemetry data from the containment chamber's surviving sensors, her face illuminated by the harsh glow of cathode ray tube monitors as she tried to make sense of readings that contradicted everything she understood about biological systems. Specifically, that Object 47 was now registering a biomass approximately 47 times larger than what had been contained in the original sample, meaning either the sensors had failed catastrophically or the organism was reproducing at a rate that shouldn't be physically possible given the available nutrients in the sealed chamber. Inside the containment chamber itself, visible through the observation window that was now developing hairline cracks from temperature stress, technicians Nestorov and Mikhailova had stopped pounding on the airlock door and instead stood pressed against the far wall, their hazmat suits' helmet lights creating isolated pools of illumination in what had become near-total darkness as the emergency lighting continued to fail in sections, while the black substance that had consumed Usenko continued its inexorable spread across floor walls and ceiling, moving in waves that seemed almost tidal in their rhythm, advancing and receding, but always gaining ground with each cycle. Sokolov found himself staring at Usenko's crystallized corpse, which remained standing in the center of the spreading darkness, like some grotesque statue, and he noticed with clinical detachment that even as he watched, new crystalline structures were forming across the dead man's exposed flesh, branching outward in fractal patterns that grew visibly with each passing second, and he realized with dawning horror that Object 47 wasn't just killing its host, but was actively transforming human tissue into something else entirely, using organic matter as raw material for its own incomprehensible purposes. The failure of communication systems extended beyond just the satellite uplink, as internal communications throughout Installation Vostok 7 began experiencing cascading degradation, with intercom systems producing the same reversed audio interference, telephone lines generating dial tones that fluctuated in frequency in ways that made personnel physically nauseous to hear them, and most disturbingly, the facility's closed-circuit television system began displaying images from cameras in sections of the installation that had been sealed and decommissioned years earlier, sections that should have been completely dark, but instead showed movement, shadows crossing through abandoned corridors in patterns that suggested coordination and purpose, rather than random equipment malfunction. It was Dr. Irina Lebedeva, working with a desperation born of watching her life's research transform into a nightmare, who discovered the files that would recontextualize everything they thought they understood about Object 47, specifically a set of documents that had been sealed in the installation's classified archive under the designation Predshestvenik, or predecessor Mao, files that Colonel Sokolov had never been briefed on despite his position as facility commander, suggesting layers of compartmentalization that extended beyond even Biopreparat's notorious obsession with secrecy. The files, some dating back to 1973 when installation Vostok 7 was still under construction, detailed how Soviet geological survey teams had discovered something anomalous while drilling core samples in the proposed location for the facility's deepest levels, specifically encountering a layer of permafrost at approximately 215 meters depth that contained organic material that should not have existed. Material that carbon dating would later suggest had been frozen for somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 years, predating human civilization in the Arctic by millennia. The initial survey team's reports, written in the matter-of-fact prose of Soviet technical documentation, described extracting core samples that contained what appeared to be fungal or bacterial colonies preserved in ice. Colonies that exhibited unusual crystalline structures within their cellular matrices, and that, disturbingly, showed signs of metabolic activity when exposed to temperatures above -10 degrees Celsius, despite having been frozen for 10,000 years. Dr. Arkady Volkov, the lead geologist on that 1973 survey, and no relation to the Yevgeny Volkov, who would later head Biopreparat's Arctic Research Division, had written in his final report, before the entire survey team was reassigned to classified locations that would later prove to be Siberian labor camps, that the organic material they had discovered appeared to exhibit properties consistent with what he termed cryogenic pseudozhyzn, or cryogenic pseudo-life organisms that existed in a state somewhere between dormancy and active metabolism, capable of surviving indefinitely in frozen conditions, while still maintaining some level of biological function that conventional scientific understanding could not adequately explain. The truly disturbing revelation came in documents dated to 1979, 6 years after the initial discovery, when biopreparat scientists had successfully isolated and begun preliminary cultivation of what they found in those core samples, organisms that ancient Nenets texts translated from oral histories recorded by Russian ethnographers in the 19th century had referred to as semena zimy, or seeds of winter, entities that supposedly emerged from the ice during brief periods of warming to consume everything living before returning to dormancy when temperatures dropped again. The Nenets accounts preserved in fragmentary form in the archives of the Russian Geographical Society and cross-referenced in the installation Vostok 7 files described these seeds of winter as possessing a form of collective awareness, capable of learning and adapting with each emergence, and most chillingly, the texts warned that the seeds should never be awakened deliberately, because they existed not as mere organisms, but as something the Nenets language termed Mest Zemli, or the Earth's revenge, a response to disruption of the natural order that would continue to evolve and persist until balance was restored, whatever that meant in practical terms. Dr. Lebedeva's voice was barely above a whisper as she read aloud the final page of the predecessor files, a memorandum dated November 1986, just 2 months before the current crisis, written by Dr. Yevgeny Volkov himself, stating that Object 47's 16th generation had demonstrated unexpected behavioral changes that suggested the organism was not responding to their genetic modifications in the expected manner, but rather appeared to be incorporating those modifications into its own evolutionary trajectory, using Soviet scientific intervention not as external manipulation, but as environmental pressure to accelerate its own development. And Volkov had recommended immediate suspension of all further cultivation pending comprehensive review, a recommendation that had apparently been overruled by someone with authority exceeding even the head of Biopreparat's Arctic Research Division, someone whose signature had been redacted from the documents but whose decision had led directly to the events now unfolding in Containment Chamber Alpha. The second catastrophic event occurred at 15:47 hours, approximately 73 minutes after technician Yusenko's death, when the black substance that had been methodically spreading across every surface of Containment Chamber Alpha suddenly accelerated its growth rate by a factor that monitoring systems would later calculate as approximately 300%. The substance beginning to pulse in waves that corresponded exactly to rhythms that Dr. Lebedeva realized with sick certainty matched the frequency of human cardiac cycles, as if Object 47 had somehow extracted and was now mimicking the biological signature of its first victim. Technicians Nestorov and Mikhailova, who had been maintaining their position against the far wall of the containment chamber in hopes that rescue was somehow still possible, suddenly found themselves engulfed in darkness as the spreading substance reached them, and their screams transmitted through the intercom system took on qualities that Lieutenant Cavern would later tell military psychiatrists reminded him of drowning. Not the sharp panic of someone struggling in water, but rather the wet, desperate sounds of lungs filling with fluid, while the victim remained conscious and aware of their own suffocation. Colonel Sokolov made the desperate decision to override safety protocols and activate the containment chamber's emergency pressure purge system, a system designed to explosively decompress the chamber by venting its atmosphere through filtration systems into the surrounding permafrost, a procedure that should theoretically have either killed or incapacitated any biological organisms through rapid pressure change and extreme cold exposure. The purge system activated with a roar that shook the entire observation gallery, and for approximately 11 seconds it appeared that Sokolov's gamble might actually work, as the containment chamber's internal pressure dropped from standard atmosphere to near vacuum, temperature plummeting to -68 degrees Celsius as Arctic air was drawn in through the purge vents, and the black substance seemed to recoil from the walls and ceiling, contracting inward toward Usenko's crystallized corpse, as if seeking shelter from the sudden environmental assault. But then in a moment that would be captured on the few security cameras still functioning, and would later be analyzed frame by bioweapons experts from 3 different nations, who would never publicly acknowledge what they had seen. Object 47 demonstrated an adaptation capability that exceeded every theoretical model of evolutionary biology, specifically beginning to generate heat internally, creating localized thermal blooms across its surface that were visible as infrared signatures even through the observation window. Heat that allowed it to not merely survive the extreme cold, but to actually use the temperature differential as a form of energy gradient. The organism growing more active rather than less as it metabolized the temperature difference itself in ways that violated the second law of thermodynamics as conventionally understood. The substance resumed its spread with renewed vigor, and worse, it began moving upward through the pressure purge vents themselves, following the path of escaping atmosphere into the filtration systems that were supposed to protect the rest of installation Vostok 7 from contamination. And alarm bells began sounding throughout the facility as sensors detected biological material in ventilation shafts that extended throughout all 7 levels of the underground complex. Dr. Lebedeva looked at Colonel Sokolov with eyes that held both accusation and desperate plea, and she asked the question that everyone present was thinking, but had been afraid to voice, specifically whether they should initiate Protocol Zarya, the installation's absolute final contingency plan that involved detonating demolition charges built into the facility's structural supports during construction. Charges designed to collapse the entire installation into its own subterranean levels, and then trigger secondary incendiary devices that would create temperatures high enough to sterilize everything, including the 73 personnel currently stationed at Vostok 7. A protocol that required authorization from Moscow but that could theoretically be initiated by the facility commander under terminal crisis conditions if communication with higher command was impossible. The observation gallery fell into stunned silence as the full implications of Lebedeva's suggestion became clear, and it was Lieutenant Cavern, young enough to still believe that rules existed for good reasons and that proper procedures could solve even catastrophic problems, who voiced the objection that Protocol Zarya's demolition charges had never been tested and might not even function after 14 years of Arctic cold, and furthermore, collapsing the facility might simply seal Object 47 into the permafrost, where it could remain viable indefinitely, waiting to be discovered by some future expedition with no knowledge of what lay buried here. The debate over whether to initiate Protocol Zarya or to continue attempting containment was interrupted by a sound that came through the intercom system from Containment Chamber Alpha, a sound that was impossible and that would haunt every surviving member of Installation Vostok 7's personnel for whatever remained of their lives, specifically what sounded distinctly and unmistakably like Technician Pavel Usenko's voice, still recognizable, despite being distorted and wrong in ways that suggested it was being produced by a mechanism that only approximated human vocal cords, saying in Russian that was grammatically perfect but emotionally empty, «Мы адаптируемся, мы распространяемся, мы сохраняемся», which translated to «We adapt, we spread, we persist». the use of plural pronouns suggesting either that Yusenko's consciousness somehow remained trapped within the crystallized structure that had been his body, or more horrifyingly, that Object 47 had evolved to the point where it could access and utilize the neural patterns stored in tissue it had consumed, creating something that could think and speak using stolen cognition, rather than possessing true awareness of its own. At 1812 hours, approximately 3 hours and 42 minutes after the initial containment breach, Installation Vostok 7's automated biological monitoring systems registered what should have been impossible, specifically detecting active Object 47 signatures in 17 separate locations throughout the facility's 7 levels, simultaneously suggesting either catastrophic sensor failure or, far worse, that the organism had spread through the ventilation system with speed and efficiency that indicated not random dispersal, but rather coordinated strategic positioning designed to maximize coverage and prevent isolation protocols from containing it. The spreading contamination manifested differently in each location, as if Object 47 was experimenting with various approaches to environmental adaptation, with Level 2 personnel reporting black crystalline growths emerging from air vents and spreading across ceiling tiles in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, while Level 5 maintenance crews described a thick, oil-like substance seeping through concrete walls that were supposed to be impermeable to biological agents, substance that left behind residue resembling burn marks except the affected surfaces were cold to the touch, registering temperatures 15 degrees below ambient. The facility's atmospheric controls began registering pressure anomalies that suggested the very air inside Installation Vostok 7 was becoming denser, though barometric readings showed no change in actual pressure, creating a sensation that multiple personnel described as similar to descending rapidly in an aircraft, ears popping and sinuses aching. Except this sensation intensified continuously rather than stabilizing, and several staff members began experiencing spontaneous nosebleeds and burst blood vessels in their eyes as their bodies reacted to environmental conditions that instruments insisted were normal, but that human physiology recognized as fundamentally wrong. The temperature throughout the installation began fluctuating in ways that defied the capabilities of the climate control systems, with some sections suddenly dropping to near freezing, while others spiked to uncomfortable warmth, and more disturbingly, these temperature zones seemed to move through the facility in patterns that suggested intentionality, herding personnel away from certain corridors and levels, while cutting off access to critical areas, including the armory, the communication center, and most critically, the emergency evacuation tunnels that led to the surface. Colonel Sokolov, who had relocated to the Level 1 Command Center along with Dr. Lebedeva and Lieutenant Kavarin, after abandoning the compromised observation gallery, watched with growing desperation as facility schematics displayed on wall-mounted monitors showed the spreading contamination in real-time red indicators blooming across the digital representation of Installation Vostok 7 like blood spreading through water, and he realized that Object 47 had achieved something that Soviet biological warfare theorists had considered theoretically possible, but practically unattainable, specifically developing into a distributed organism that could function as both individual cells and as a coordinated collective entity, each part acting independently while simultaneously contributing to larger strategic objectives. The Arctic sky above the installation, visible through security cameras monitoring the surface entrance, began exhibiting phenomena that meteorological science could not adequately explain, with aurora borealis appearing despite solar activity being at minimum levels, lights that pulsed in rhythms that matched the growth cycles of Object 47 below ground, while the temperature on the surface, which should have been holding steady at -43 degrees Celsius, began rising slowly, but inexorably permafrost that had been frozen solid for millennia, beginning to soften and release methane pockets that ignited spontaneously in the super cold air, creating ghostly blue flames that danced across the tundra like funeral pyres welcoming the dead. The psychological deterioration of Installation Vostok 7's personnel manifested first in the junior staff members, those with less training in managing crisis situations and less familiarity with the reality that military biological research sometimes produced results that exceeded containment capabilities. With 3 technicians from Level 6 attempting to force open the emergency surface access tunnel, using cutting torches, despite Lieutenant Caverin's direct orders to remain at their stations. Their actions growing increasingly frantic and uncoordinated as panic overrode training and discipline, ultimately resulting in one of them accidentally breaching a high-pressure coolant line that flooded an entire corridor section with liquid nitrogen, flash freezing everything in a 20-meter radius, including the 2 colleagues he had been working alongside. Their bodies transformed into brittle statues that shattered when recovery teams attempted to move them hours later. Dr. Lebedeva exhibited signs of dissociative crisis sitting at her workstation and repeatedly running the same genetic analysis algorithms on Object 47 samples from before the breach, her hands moving mechanically across the keyboard, while her eyes remained unfocused and distant. And when Colonel Sokolov attempted to engage her in discussion about containment options, she responded by laughing, a sound utterly devoid of humor or sanity, and stating that containment was a meaningless concept when dealing with an organism that existed in a state of perpetual becoming, constantly rewriting its own genetic code in response to environmental pressures, essentially functioning as evolution compressed into hours rather than millennia. Senior personnel from the facility's medical section reported treating 14 cases of acute psychological breaks within a 2-hour period, soldiers and scientists alike experiencing hallucinations that monitoring equipment suggested might not be entirely hallucinatory. Specifically, multiple individuals reporting seeing crystalline humanoid figures moving through corridors in their peripheral vision, figures that disappeared when looked at directly but left behind footprints of black organic residue that analysis would later confirm contained viable Object 47 material, suggesting either mass hysteria was somehow producing physical evidence, or the organism had developed capabilities extending into sensory manipulation and perception alteration. The facility's electronic equipment continued degrading in ways that suggested something more than simple mechanical failure, with computer systems displaying data that hadn't been inputted, running programs that weren't in their operating systems, and most disturbingly, several terminals began generating text files that appeared to be attempts at communication. Strings of characters that linguistic analysis suggested approximated Russian grammar and syntax, but that used words in combinations that conveyed meanings hovering just beyond comprehension. Messages that read like fever dreams transcribed by something that understood language structure, but not semantic meaning. Phrases such as, "Cold dreams remember forward," and "We are the patient Earth awakening," that made grammatical sense individually, but created cognitive dissonance when assembled into sequences. Lieutenant Caverin, whose military training had prepared him for combat stress and chemical weapons and even nuclear warfare, but had not adequately addressed scenarios involving biological agents that appeared to possess something approaching intelligence, began exhibiting signs of command paralysis, sitting in the communications center and repeatedly attempting to establish contact with Moscow despite every previous attempt having failed, his voice becoming increasingly desperate as he recited authorization codes and identification protocols into dead radio channels, as if believing that proper adherence to procedure could somehow reimpose order on a situation that had transcended all established protocols and contingencies. Multiple personnel reported experiencing what they described as a sensation of being watched, not by human observers but by something vast and distributed throughout the facility, an attention that pressed against consciousness like atmospheric pressure, and several individuals became convinced that Object 47 was not simply spreading through installation Vostok 7, but was studying them, analyzing human behavior and psychology with the same clinical detachment that Soviet scientists had once applied to studying it. The predator and prey roles having reversed in a way that left everyone feeling exposed and vulnerable, in ways that went beyond mere physical danger. The facility's internal sensors, those that remained functional, detected movement patterns in contaminated sections that suggested coordination, exceeding what should be possible for mindless biological material, with multiple instances of Object 47 masses appearing to avoid areas where personnel had established defensive positions using improvised flamethrowers constructed from maintenance equipment, while simultaneously probing for weaknesses in those defensive perimeters, testing responses and adapting tactics in real time, like a military commander conducting reconnaissance. And this apparent strategic thinking terrified the installation's personnel far more than simple aggressive expansion would have. because it implied they were not dealing with a biological weapon that had escaped containment, but rather with something that was actively and intelligently conducting an invasion of the facility that had created it. At 21:34 hours, as Installation Vostok 7 approached the end of its 72nd hour since initial quarantine protocol activation, Colonel Sokolov stood in the Level 1 command center and acknowledged what he had been refusing to accept for the previous 6 hours, specifically that Protocol Zarya was no longer optional, but rather represented the only remaining action that might prevent Object 47 from reaching the surface and spreading beyond the isolation of Novaya Zemlya into the broader Arctic ecosystem and potentially beyond. The command center's walls, constructed from reinforced concrete that had been poured specifically to withstand nuclear near misses, had begun showing signs of contamination, hairline cracks appearing in the structural material, and leaking a viscous black substance that moved against gravity, flowing upward toward the ceiling in defiance of physics, while the air itself had taken on a quality that made breathing feel labored and uncomfortable, as if the oxygen content was being systematically depleted by an organism that had learned to metabolize atmospheric gases in addition to organic matter. The surviving personnel, now numbering 41 out of the original 73 who had been present when containment first failed, had been consolidated into 3 defensive positions in Level 1 and Level 2, armed with improvised incendiary weapons and protected by barriers constructed from equipment and furniture. But these positions were deteriorating as Object 47 continued its inexorable advance. The organism having apparently learned that direct assault was unnecessary when it could simply wait for human endurance to fail, for fuel supplies to be exhausted, for the psychological pressure of being besieged to break morale and cohesion. Dr. Lebedeva had recovered enough of her scientific composure to present Sokolov with an analysis that was as thorough as it was hopeless. Specifically, her calculations suggesting that Object 47's current biomass exceeded 47,000 kilograms despite having originated from a sample measuring less than 200 grams, meaning the organism had increased its mass by a factor of approximately 235,000 in less than 8 hours growth that required it to be converting not just the organic materials it encountered, but also synthesizing matter from the surrounding environment itself, possibly breaking down concrete and metal at the molecular level and reorganizing those atoms into biological structures, a capability that, if confirmed, would represent a fundamental breakthrough in understanding matter and energy that would revolutionize science if anyone survived to document it. The facility's automated systems, though still responding to human commands, indicated that structural integrity throughout Installation Vostok 7 had degraded by 37%, with load-bearing supports in multiple levels, showing stress fractures and weight redistribution that suggested the entire complex was at risk of catastrophic collapse, even without the demolition charges of Protocol Zarya being activated, as if Object 47's consumption of building materials was undermining the physical foundations that kept hundreds of meters of permafrost and rock from crushing everything beneath. Lieutenant Kavarin had made peace with the necessity of Protocol Zarya and was working with the facility's surviving engineers to verify that the demolition system remained functional despite 14 years of Arctic conditions and the recent spread of contamination through electrical systems, their preliminary assessment suggesting they had perhaps a 60% confidence that the charges would detonate in proper sequence when activated. But even if the system functioned perfectly, the destruction would be absolute, designed to collapse all 7 levels into a compressed mass before secondary incendiary charges raise temperatures high enough to vaporize organic matter and fuse rock into glass, a process that would take approximately 40 minutes from initiation to completion, 40 minutes during which everyone remaining in Installation Vostok 7 would experience death that military protocols euphemistically described as rapid, but that would in reality be neither quick nor painless. The final indication that their situation had progressed beyond any possibility of recovery came when the surface monitoring cameras positioned around the installation's entrance tunnel 300 meters away from the main complex detected movement on the tundra, specifically showing that Object 47 had somehow breached to the surface through ventilation shafts or permafrost fractures, black organic masses spreading across the snow in patterns that resembled root systems or neural networks reaching outward from the installation in all directions like fingers searching for something, And Colonel Sokolov realized that even Protocol Zarya might no longer be sufficient, because Object 47 had already escaped the facility's perimeter, meaning at best they could destroy what remained contained underground. But the organism's surface expansion would continue, unless they could find some way to sterilize square kilometers of Arctic tundra, a capability that Installation Vostok 7 did not possess. The command center's lights began flickering in patterns that matched cardiac rhythms once again, and through the failing illumination, Sokolov could see black substance beginning to seep through the sealed door that separated the command center from the corridor beyond, substance that pulsed and moved with undeniable purpose. And he exchanged a look with Dr. Lebedeva and Lieutenant Kavrin that communicated what words could not adequately express, specifically the understanding that they had minutes at best before Object 47 breached their final defensive position. And the only question remaining was whether Sokolov would activate Protocol Zarya with enough lead time to ensure the demolition sequence completed before the organism consumed or disabled the detonation systems, a decision that required condemning 41 people to certain death in order to potentially prevent something far worse. And as his hand moved toward the Protocol Zarya authorization switch, the lights in the command center died, completely plunging everything into absolute darkness, broken only by emergency chemical lights. And in that darkness they could hear something moving, something vast and patient and utterly inhuman, something that had waited frozen in permafrost for 10,000 years and would wait 10,000 more if necessary, because Object 47 existed on timescales that made human urgency irrelevant. And they understood with terrible clarity that they were not fighting to survive, but rather struggling to delay the inevitable for just long enough to prevent their failure from becoming humanity's extinction event. Colonel Sokolov's finger was millimeters from the Protocol Zarya activation switch when the command center's emergency radio system, which had been producing nothing but static and reversed audio interference for the previous 7 hours, suddenly crackled to life with a transmission in clear Russian, a voice identifying itself as Major General Konstantin Petrov of the Soviet Air Defense Forces Northern Command, stating that long-range reconnaissance satellites had detected thermal anomalies at Installation Vostok 7's coordinates, and that a tactical response team was inbound via Mi-24 helicopter gunships with an estimated arrival time of 14 minutes, orders from Moscow Command being to establish a defensive perimeter and prepare for emergency evacuation of all surviving personnel. The transmission's clarity and specificity cut through the fog of exhaustion and despair that had settled over the command center's survivors, but it also raised immediate questions about how Moscow had detected the crisis when all attempts at communication from the installation had failed, and more disturbingly, how they had mobilized a tactical response in what must have been less than 3 hours, when standard protocols required minimum 12 hours for authorization of military operations in restricted biological research facilities. Lieutenant Kavrin, displaying presence of mind that his training demanded despite psychological exhaustion, immediately questioned whether the transmission was legitimate or whether Object 47 had somehow achieved the capability to generate synthetic radio communications as part of a strategy to prevent Protocol Zarya activation, a paranoid-sounding suggestion that nonetheless had to be considered given the organism's demonstrated ability to access and utilize information from consumed neural tissue. The debate over the transmission's authenticity became moot approximately 9 minutes later, when personnel monitoring surface cameras reported visual confirmation of 4 Mi-24 attack helicopters approaching from the southeast, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable even through the Arctic darkness and the strange aurora that continued pulsing in the sky above Installation Vostok 7. And as the aircraft established holding patterns around the facility's surface entrance, their thermal imaging and spotlight systems illuminated the full extent of Object 47's surface expansion, revealing that black organic material had spread across approximately 2 square kilometers of tundra in geometric patterns that resembled circuit boards or neural pathways more than random biological growth. The helicopter's arrival coincided with a sudden and dramatic change in Object 47's behavior throughout the installation. Specifically, the advancing masses of contamination that had been steadily pressing toward the command center's position suddenly began withdrawing, retreating through corridors and ventilation systems with speed that suggested not panic, but rather tactical repositioning, as if the organism recognized the helicopters as a threat requiring different response strategies than those effective against trapped personnel with limited resources. Dr. Lebedeva watched monitoring systems that showed contamination signatures decreasing across multiple levels and sectors. Object 47 consolidating its distributed biomass into concentrated nodes in the installation's deepest sections, behavior that she described as eerily reminiscent of military units conducting fighting withdrawal to prepared defensive positions, and she voiced what everyone was thinking, but had been afraid to articulate, specifically that Object 47's apparent intelligence wasn't emerging gradually through evolutionary adaptation, but rather had been present from the beginning, hidden in the genetic information preserved in that ancient permafrost intelligence that had been observing and learning throughout the entire crisis, using Installation Vostok 7's personnel as test subjects to evaluate human capabilities and limitations before the organism's true expansion began. The surface response team, equipped with sealed environmental suits that bore no standard Soviet military markings and carrying weapons that included modified flamethrower units and what appeared to be experimental directed energy devices, established entry into Level 1 through emergency access tunnels at 22:01 hours. And their commander, a man who identified himself only as Colonel Zhukov, and whose credentials suggested affiliation with organizations that officially did not exist, informed Sokolov that evacuation would proceed immediately with no delays for equipment or documentation. All surviving personnel to be extracted to a secure facility in the Ural Mountains for medical evaluation and debriefing that would likely last several months. The extraction proceeded with military efficiency that bordered on rehearsed, as if these response teams had conducted similar operations before, personnel being moved in groups of 5 through corridors that had been cleared of contamination by methods that Colonel Zhukov declined to explain. And the survivors who were physically capable of walking noticed with growing unease that the response team members showed no surprise or horror at the crystalline structures and organic masses they encountered, their reactions suggesting familiarity rather than shock, as if Installation Vostok 7 represented not an unprecedented disaster, but rather one incident in a pattern of similar events. The final group to be evacuated, consisting of Colonel Sokolov, Dr. Lebedeva, Lieutenant Kavarin, and 6 others who had survived the 72 hours in the command center, emerged onto the Arctic surface at 22:47 hours to find that the military response had expanded to include perimeter security, establishing a cordon 3 kilometers in radius around the installation, mobile decontamination units processing evacuated personnel through chemical showers and radiation scanners that seemed excessive for biological containment, and most ominously, a Tupolev Tu-95 strategic bomber circling at high altitude, its payload bay doors already open in preparation for what Soviet military doctrine termed sanitization strikes, conventional and incendiary weapons designed to raise surface temperatures across the target zone to levels sufficient for complete biological sterilization. The sanitization of Installation Vostok 7 commenced at 0034 hours on January 24, 1987, approximately 73 hours and 4 minutes after initial quarantine protocols were activated, the Tupolev Tu-95 bomber executing 3 consecutive attack runs that delivered a combination of high explosive ordnance designed to collapse underground structures, followed by specialized incendiary munitions that Soviet weapons designers had developed specifically for scenarios requiring elimination of biological contamination across large areas. Weapons that burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius and consumed available oxygen in massive fireballs that could be seen from weather satellites monitoring Arctic regions. Colonel Sokolov and the other survivors confined to medical isolation units aboard transport helicopters that had lifted off before the bombing commenced, watched through reinforced windows as Installation Vostok 7's surface entrance disappeared beneath sequential explosions that turned 2 square kilometers of tundra into a hellscape of fire and molten rock. The strange aurora that had been pulsing in synchronization with Object 47's growth cycles suddenly flaring to unprecedented brightness before collapsing into darkness, as if something vast had just died or been forcibly disconnected. The detonations continued for 47 minutes, systematic and thorough, followed by secondary strikes using thermobaric weapons that generated pressure waves sufficient to collapse any remaining structural voids in the underground complex. and infrared monitoring from reconnaissance aircraft confirmed that temperatures in the target zone remained above sterilization thresholds for 6 hours following the attack permafrost, melting to unprecedented depths before the Arctic cold eventually reasserted dominance and began the slow process of refreezing the devastated landscape. Dr. Lebedeva, sedated but conscious in her medical isolation unit, watched the destruction of 14 years of research and 72 hours of nightmare, and she noticed with clinical detachment born of exhaustion that Colonel Zhukov and his response team members showed no emotional reaction to the obliteration of the facility, their faces reflecting neither satisfaction at successful containment nor regret at the necessity of such extreme measures, expressions that suggested they had witnessed similar events before and expected to witness them again. Soldiers in an undeclared war against threats that official Soviet policy insisted did not exist. The transport helicopters delivered their cargo of survivors not to standard military medical facilities, but rather to a research complex buried in the Ural Mountains near Sverdlovsk, a facility whose existence was classified at levels exceeding even biopreparat's highest security protocols, and upon arrival personnel were immediately separated into individual containment units, where they underwent 72 hours of intensive medical screening that included blood work, tissue biopsies, neurological evaluations, and psychological assessments that seemed more interested in what they remembered than in their physical condition. Colonel Sokolov underwent debriefing sessions conducted by officers whose uniforms bore no identifying marks and whose questions revealed familiarity with details about Object 47 that he himself had only learned in the final hours before evacuation, suggesting these interrogators had access to information sources extending beyond Installation Vostok 7's documentation. And when Sokolov asked directly whether similar incidents had occurred at other facilities, his interrogator simply smiled without warmth and stated that such questions fell outside Sokolov's security clearance and that continued inquiry would be interpreted as potential security violations subject to remedial measures that were not specified, but were clearly understood as threats. The official report generated by Soviet military intelligence, a document that would remain classified for decades before being partially released following the Soviet Union's dissolution, attributed Installation Vostok 7's destruction to catastrophic structural failure, resulting from permafrost instability combined with equipment malfunction leading to uncontrolled fire in chemical storage areas. A cover story that explained the bombing campaign as emergency response to prevent environmental contamination from burning chemical weapons, stockpiles, and this official narrative was supported by fabricated documentation, testimony from paid witnesses who had never been within 500 kilometers of Novaya Zemlya, and the convenient fact that the installation's actual purpose and even its existence were already protected by multiple layers of classification that made independent verification impossible. The families of the 32 personnel who had died during the 72 hours of quarantine received notification that their loved ones had perished in industrial accidents at various military facilities across the Soviet Union. Deaths separated geographically and temporally in official records to prevent pattern recognition, and these families were offered generous compensation packages contingent upon signing non-disclosure agreements and accepting that certain details about their relatives' work and death would remain permanently classified for reasons of national security. Dr. Irina Lebedeva spent 14 months in the Ural Mountains facility, undergoing what was termed comprehensive rehabilitation, during which time she was required to reproduce from memory all research documentation related to Object 47's development, subjected to experimental treatments designed to verify she had not been infected or contaminated in ways that standard medical screening might miss, and required to participate in what her handlers called cognitive realignment sessions, that civilian terminology would recognize as intensive psychological conditioning designed to reshape memories and suppress specific knowledge. Lieutenant Dmitry Kavarin received reassignment to a naval base on the Kamchatka Peninsula, literally the opposite end of the Soviet Union from Novaya Zemlya, where his duties involved monitoring fishing vessel traffic and had no connection whatsoever to biological research. His personnel file noting exemplary service but containing no mention of Installation Vostok 7 or the events of January 1987 and the 2 letters he attempted to send to his sister describing what he had witnessed were intercepted by military censors and resulted in official reprimands warning that future violations of security protocols would result in more serious consequences. Colonel Viktor Sokolov, whose decisions during the crisis had arguably prevented Object 47's uncontrolled expansion beyond installation Vostok 7's immediate vicinity, received neither commendation nor punishment, but rather was quietly retired from active service at age 44, with full pension and housing assignment in Novosibirsk, where he lived under what he eventually recognized as permanent surveillance, his apartment wired with listening devices. His movements tracked by rotating teams of handlers who made no effort to remain invisible. A message that his continued health and freedom were contingent upon maintaining silence about events that officially had never occurred. The physical evidence from installation Vostok 7, those samples and documentation that survived the evacuation, disappeared into secure storage facilities whose locations were known only to the highest levels of Soviet military and political leadership, though persistent rumors within the intelligence community suggested that frozen samples of Object 47 tissue were maintained at multiple secure locations as insurance against future research needs. The organism's demonstrated capabilities being simultaneously too dangerous to allow free and too potentially valuable to completely destroy, especially given Cold War calculations about maintaining parity with presumed American biological weapons capabilities. In the years following installation Vostok 7's destruction, satellite monitoring of the Novaya Zemlya bombing site revealed anomalies that never appeared in official reports, but that were noted in classified documents circulated among very limited distribution lists within Soviet and later Russian Federation defense establishments. Specifically, that permafrost in the impact zone exhibited refreezing patterns inconsistent with standard thermal modeling, with certain areas remaining slightly warmer than ambient temperature, despite years of Arctic exposure, as if something beneath the frozen surface was generating minimal but persistent heat. Seismic monitoring stations positioned around Novaya Zemlya to detect potential nuclear testing detected periodic low-frequency vibrations emanating from the former. Installation Vostok 7 site vibrations that occurred in regular intervals roughly corresponding to 37-day cycles patterns that geologists could not attribute to any known natural phenomenon, and that suggested either equipment still functioning beneath the collapsed facility or something else entirely. Something that had survived sanitization and remained active in ways that conventional biology suggested should be impossible. Dr. Lebedeva, released from rehabilitation in 1988 and assigned to teaching position at Moscow State University, where her research focused on theoretical biology far removed from practical applications, maintained private journals that would be discovered after her death from unexplained respiratory failure in 1996. Journals containing observations suggesting she believed Object 47 represented not a weapon that Soviet science had created, but rather something ancient that had simply been awakened and temporarily constrained. An organism, or perhaps a distributed intelligence that existed in timescales measuring millennia rather than decades, and that installation Vostok 7's destruction had merely returned it to dormancy rather than achieving actual elimination. The International Biological Weapons Monitoring Regime established after the Cold War's conclusion included provisions for mutual inspection of suspected biological research facilities. But when international observers requested access to Novaya Zemlya sites in 1994, Russian Federation authorities permitted inspection of locations where nuclear testing had occurred, while quietly refusing access to the coordinates where installation Vostok 7 had stood, citing unexploded ordnance hazards and environmental contamination that made the area unsafe for human presence. Excuses that were technically plausible, but that raised questions among observers about what might actually require such permanent exclusion. Colonel Viktor Sokolov lived until 2003, dying at age 60, from what medical records attributed to natural causes, though autopsy revealed tissue abnormalities that pathologists noted bore resemblance to crystalline structures previously unknown in human biology structures that were photographed, cataloged, and then apparently lost in administrative transfer between medical facilities. The pathologist who conducted the examination, dying in an automobile accident 6 weeks later, under circumstances that local police found sufficiently suspicious to open investigation that was subsequently closed by federal authorities, citing national security concerns. The current status of the installation Vostok 7 site remains classified, though commercial satellite imagery available to public analysis shows an area of Novaya Zemlya where snow coverage exhibits unusual geometric patterns, visible from orbit patterns that change slowly over years, but that maintain consistent overall structure, resembling neural networks, or perhaps something else for which human observers lack adequate reference terminology. And the Russian Federation maintains permanent monitoring station 50 kilometers from the site, staffed by rotating personnel who serve 3-month assignments and who are subject to medical screening protocols usually reserved for hazardous duty assignments, despite official documentation stating they are simply conducting meteorological research. The seeds of winter, as ancient Nenet's wisdom had termed them, remain buried beneath permafrost and bomb-shattered rock and the weight of official denial, and perhaps that is sufficient containment. Or perhaps it merely represents humanity's preference for comfortable lies over terrifying truths. The belief that enough explosives and enough steel and enough concrete can permanently seal away things that existed long before human civilization, and that will likely persist long after. Entities that measure their existence not in human years, but in glacial epochs. And that view the brief 72 hours of installation Vostok 7's quarantine as nothing more than a momentary interruption in a patience that encompasses geological time itself, waiting in frozen darkness for the inevitable moment when permafrost melts or human curiosity overcomes caution, and the cycle begins again. The official Soviet records regarding installation Vostok 7 were systematically falsified over the months following the January 1987 incident, with personnel files being altered to show that the facility's staff had been distributed across various other military research installations throughout the Soviet Union years before the actual events occurred, making it appear that Vostok 7 had been decommissioned in 1984 and repurposed as a weather monitoring station rather than an active biological weapons laboratory. Colonel Viktor Mikhailovich Sokolov spent his forced retirement in Novosibirsk under constant surveillance until his death in 2003, his medical records showing tissue abnormalities that were photographed and then mysteriously lost. While Dr. Irina Lebedeva taught theoretical biology at Moscow State University until her unexplained respiratory failure in 1996, her private journal suggesting she believed Object 47 was something ancient that Soviet science had merely awakened rather than created, journals that disappeared from evidence storage within weeks of her death. Lieutenant Dmitry Kavarin served out his reassignment on the Kamchatka Peninsula in obscurity, his 2 attempts to document what he had witnessed resulting in intercepted letters and official reprimands that made clear his continued freedom depended on permanent silence. And he died in 2008 from complications related to what doctors termed early-onset dementia, though his medical history showed cognitive decline patterns inconsistent with any known neurological disease. The 32 personnel who perished during the 72-hour quarantine were listed as having died in separate industrial accidents across multiple facilities and time periods, their families receiving generous compensation contingent upon signing non-disclosure agreements, ensuring that no pattern would emerge to suggest a single catastrophic event. And the children of technician Pavel Usenko were told their father died heroically preventing a chemical spill at a munitions factory in the Urals, a comfortable lie that spared them knowledge of how he actually spent his final moments being transformed into crystalline structures by an organism that had waited 10,000 years in frozen darkness. Senior scientists from Biopreparat, who had oversight of the Object 47 project, received quiet reassignments to administrative positions far removed from active research. Their careers effectively ended without formal reprimand, and at least 3 of them died under circumstances that official reports attributed to natural causes, but that shared common elements of sudden respiratory failure and post-mortem tissue abnormalities that were noted by pathologists before the relevant documentation vanished into classification. The physical samples of Object 47 that survived the installation Vostok 7 evacuation were reportedly transferred to secure biological containment facilities in locations that remain classified even after the Soviet Union's dissolution, though persistent rumors within Russia's intelligence community suggest that multiple backup samples were distributed to separate storage sites as insurance against loss. The organism's demonstrated capabilities being simultaneously too dangerous to study openly and too potentially valuable to completely destroy, especially given that American and other Western powers were presumed to have their own comparable research programs that official channels would never acknowledge. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.